Going to start with a question. Children, limited children, but smart children. What does Jesus mean when he says, in a little while you won't see me, in a little while you will see me? Do you know what that means? If you're a little confused, it's okay, because so were the disciples, all right? Let's have a look at in verse 16 when Jesus says, a little while and you will not see me, and a little while, and again a little while, and you will see me, because I go to the Father. And notice the disciples don't know what he's talking about. Verse 17. Then some of his disciples said among themselves, what is this that he says to us? A little while and you will not see me, and again a little while and you will see me, and because I go to the Father. They said therefore, what is this that he says? A little while. We don't know what he's saying. What they're really saying is, how do you make sense of a Messiah? Here's the one here they've put all their hopes in. He's going to rout the Romans, is going to bring in his kingdom, and he's saying he's going away. What's this? What kind of a Messiah who's going to win the victory for us and bring in the kingdom is going away, abandoning him, as it were? Yeah, he said he's going to give another cancer, but I'm leaving. And all this is going to happen in a little while. What does it all mean? So Jesus knows they're struggling. In verse 19, now Jesus knew that they desired to ask him, and he said to them, are you inquiring among yourselves about what I said? A little while and you will not see me, and again a little while and you will see me? Most assuredly I say to you that you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice, and you will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will be turned into joy. So he sees the disciples haven't really got this chronology of all the things that are going to happen. So he tries to reassure them with a metaphor, an analogy. Verse 21, a woman when she is in labour has sorrow because her hour has come. But as soon as she has given birth to the child, she no longer remembers the anguish for joy that a human being has been born into the world. Therefore, you now have sorrow, but I will see you again, and your heart will rejoice, and your joy no one will take from you. So, using this analogy of a mother giving birth. Now, this is not my field of expertise, but I'm sure there are mums who can give stories of difficult times and joy afterwards and all these sorts of things. I remember my mother-in-law told me a story how when she was giving birth, she said her husband and her had worked out the name of the child and everything, and they'd settled on that. And right at the moment when she was in that moment where she's giving birth, and the pain and the stress and the anxiety and everything, and they have to leave the room with the babies and everything, that's stressful, and bringing back bad memories, I think. But she said right in that moment, her husband says to her, look, I know we had the name, but why don't we just name her Diana? And she goes, she said, I'm so out of it. Oh, whatever. He got me right at the moment. He fooled me. So I thought, I'm going to try this. When Diana was giving birth, and we'd already worked out the name and everything, and I tried right at that moment when she's giving birth, and it's the anxiety and the pain and everything, and I said, why don't we name him after my dad? And she said, no, his name is Luke. and I'm in that moment of anxiety. I went, whatever. So it does work. The time of birth is a time of pain for the mother, tension, anticipation, anxiety. But then there's the joy afterwards. Jesus is using this metaphor to try and get through to the disciples what they're about to go through. And the metaphor would have really struck home particularly for those people in the ancient world. Because every time a mother gave birth, the mother's life was on the line. It was a life-threatening situation. and especially for the baby. So in the ancient world, a very high death rate for children at birth, as well as mothers. So what joy when everyone's safe and the baby is born. And that's what Jesus... So for these people, with no modern medicine or epidurals or anything, and a high death rate for both mother and baby, they would have got this. They would have got this metaphor. And it's a metaphor that Jesus is using to say, I'm going to go away and die, and you're going to grieve. You're going to be in sorrow. But then there's going to come a time where you're going to see me again. He's talking about his death and then his resurrection. That's what he's preparing them for. And of course they would have thought of that when they saw him brutally beaten and then nailed to the cross and going through that horrible thing. And then they saw him again and they could recall this. And that's what Jesus is trying to get at. And the only way all this could happen, of course, is Jesus is predicting this to be true. The only way it could happen is if he's who he said he is. And that's what they come to realize when he says in verse 28, he's been speaking about different things in metaphor, and then he says in verse 28, I came forth from the Father and have come into the world again. I leave the world and go to the Father. Again, I leave the world and go to the Father. In other words, I'm from God. Of course, this is going to happen exactly as I said. And that is where the disciples finally get it. So what he's saying is that all these things are going to happen in their time, the way I'm describing them, because I'm not just a teacher. I'm not just a Messiah who's a military leader. I'm from God. Verse 29, his disciples said to him, see, now you are speaking plainly and using no figure of speech. Now we are sure you know all things and have no need that anyone should question you. By this we believe that you came forth from God. Now we get it. Now we get it, so everything will be easy, right? Wait a minute. Jesus says then in verse 31, Jesus answered, you believe at last. Literally, in the original Greek language, it's actually, do you believe? Do you really? It's a question in the original language. Do you really believe? In other words, yeah, we got it, everything will be good. Oh, really? Have you really got it? Because Jesus is about to tell them it's not going to be as easy as you think. Read verse 33 with me. These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation. But be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. In other words, he's saying, don't forget I told you this. When trouble comes, when tribulation comes, because it's going to come. And if you remember that, you will have peace, because you remember the very God of the universe came and told you in advance it was going to happen. And the disciples got it. John, the guy who wrote this gospel down, he got it. He's right there listening to Jesus. That's how come we're reading it now. John's recording it. Remember, John's the disciple whom Jesus loved. He listened, he hung on every word that Jesus said. In fact, John actually got something here. It impacted him so much that it seems that he might have got it even more than any of the other disciples. It impacted him. You know, John, like the others, was worried. Jesus is leaving. John, like the others, had been there through all the trials and all the things that they'd gone through, and was worried that Jesus has just told them before this that he's going to leave them. John is worried that they're going to have to mourn and weep because Jesus said so. And he was just like them, wondering, well, what happened to the great military victory? What happened to the defeat of the Romans that the Messiah is supposed to bring in? And if the world's rejoicing, as Jesus said, that means they've finally got him, they're going to kill him. What's all this stuff about, childbirth and a woman going through the pain of childbirth? John thought about those words. And there's a little something in the way he records it and how he remembers the things that Jesus said that none of the other gospel writers did. Read again with me the analogy, the metaphor that Jesus uses from verse 21. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. So with you, now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. And with this time of grief, and there's going to be a time of joy. John got it. John got something that he highlights. There's a time. Now, in the original language, is literally an hour. That is, it's specific, pointing to a time, either a period of time or a specific time. Literally an hour, but meaning a specific time. And John had seen how many times in the previous 3 years walking with Jesus that things looked so bad that they thought it was the end. But that God had a purpose and overcame every time. John got it. Something about so powerfully that John wrote down, and we're going to have a look at this, but he actually weaves a little theme through his gospel that he picks up on again here, about the fact that God is so powerfully in control of every hour of all time, and that God overcomes. And that's what Jesus says at the end of our text that we've just read. Not just that you're going to have grief, but don't worry, because I overcome the whole world. And John got this in a way, and it must have impacted him. He's tried to impart it to his readers, and down through the last 2,000 years, careful readers of John's Gospel have been strengthened by this little subplot, this little theme that John weaves through his Gospel into the record and life of his experience walking with Jesus. And John wrote it down, and what he wrote became part of a book that became the biggest selling book in the history of the world, the Bible. But only John brings this recurring theme. There is a time, literally an hour, there is a time for all things. But Jesus is the God of that time, and he overcomes. There'll be times when things look bad, so bad, it will be a time for grief. John saw it firsthand, and it impacted him because, remember, he's writing this gospel into his old age, and he remembers. He can recall the very first time that Jesus referred to this time as being something specific that's in the control of God. Think back to near the start of the Gospel of John. John remembers, he must have remembered, he wrote it down, none of the other Gospel writers did, the time where they were all the disciples were invited to a wedding banquet and a wedding celebration, and there they were, all the disciples, Matthew, John, Thomas, Bartholomew, they're all there. And on that occasion, Jesus even had to tell his own mother Mary about the importance of God's time. God's time in all things. If you remember the story, Mary was concerned about the embarrassment, the wedding reception. Lord forbid they ran out of wine. Well, the Lord did forbid it. He took care of it. And what was that really all about? Jesus was more concerned about God's time than just the human embarrassment or worry. That God had a time for Jesus himself to be revealed to Israel. The cross itself, the big picture of what really was important. John didn't forget it, and he wrote it down in the only Gospel writer to record it. Look at John chapter 2 verse 4. Dear woman, why do you involve me? Jesus says to his mother. Jesus replied, my time has not yet come. We've got to, some could take this the wrong way and say, oh, he's not being respectful to his mother. No, he's trying to get her to get under the submission to God's time, the right time. Wait on God's time. Don't try and rush ahead in God's time. Again, only John wrote down the encounter with the Samaritan woman. Read it with me, John 4 verse 21. Jesus declared, believe me, woman, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. So there's another time coming. You're talking about how we worship, but there's a time coming. Wait on that time. And during those 3 years that John walked with Jesus, he started to get the picture. Every time there was trouble, every time things looked really bad, just like the woman in labour and the pain and the difficulty, and then there would be an overcoming and a joy. Every time it looked impossible, even when it looked like the end, like the time when they cornered Jesus on the hill, they were going to throw him off to his death. And the scripture says that he just walked right through him. Why? It was not his time. And John records some of these mentioning this issue. Look at the way John records when they tried to kill Jesus for healing the man on the Sabbath. John writes it out like this, John 7 verse 30. At this, they tried to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him. How? Why did they lay a hand on him? Because his time had not yet come. They can try all they like, but if it's not God's time, it ain't going to happen. And when they tried to kill him before the feast, even his own brothers didn't believe. And remember what Jesus said to his brothers. John recorded that too. John chapter 7 verse 8. You go to the feast. I'm not yet going up to this feast because for me the right time has not yet come. John got it. John got it. And when the Pharisees were debating Jesus in the temple, John would remember that one. Years later, he wrote down in John 8 verse 20, he spoke these words while teaching in the temple area near the place where the offerings were put, yet no one seized him because his time had not yet come. None of the other gospel writers include this kind of theme. Every time that it looked bad for Jesus, John noted that he would escape their grasp when they tried to stone him to death for claiming to be God. in John 10. He escapes. There were times where the wind and the waves were going to overwhelm him, but no, it didn't happen. Why? Because God is a God of all time, and He's in control of every second of time. Most of these sayings that John is included and recorded are heading towards one specific event of time, that is the cross. Most of them. John 12:23, we won't look at it now, but that Jesus says, my time has now come. And that's what it was all building up to. Save me from this time or this hour. No, this is what I came for. So most of these time sayings are specifically building up to a point which we will look at in the next chapter, chapter 17, verse 1. Father, the time has come. What time? The cross. The cross. And that's what Jesus is actually speaking of when the disciples couldn't get it. Back in our text, in verse 22, Jesus says, so with you, now is your time of grief, the cross. But I will see you again, the resurrection, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. Once those guys had seen Jesus dead and gone, and then suddenly there he is, alive on the third day, nothing could stop him. That's why we're here today. Because the power that these scaredy cats before and suddenly are willing to go to their deaths to proclaim why? Because they'd seen the risen Christ. They had such joy, it couldn't be stopped. If you can see by faith that Christ is risen, then you know God. And you know the meaning of life. And nothing will stop you. And if you've been a bit complacent, go back to His death and resurrection. So, Jesus was, in most of these time sayings, is referring to the cross and His resurrection. But that's not all. Because right in our text, we've also seen Jesus pointing John forwards to another time. Our time. A time when there will be grief, trouble, literally tribulation. And what does He say? Don't worry, because I've overcome that time as well. See, Jesus was teaching His disciples not only about His own destiny, which of course He was, but God's sovereign power over time. It's not just some willy-nilly luck thing that happens. Time is a plan. Even our own lives, because we have a specific time. What does it, the book of Acts say? That God determined every human being, where they live on the face of the earth, and He determined the times set for them and the exact places where they should live. There's no coincidence in your life. Even the bad things that have happened had a purpose and a plan. And He even says in that same text in Acts what that plan was. God did this. Hey, what did God do that for me? I had something really bad going in my life. Why did God do it? God did this so that you would seek Him. Seek Him and find Him. Reach out for Him, though He's not far from each one of us. That's part of the God of all time. Don't ever look back at any bad things that happen and go, oh man, can't I do that? That's really bad. No, it's God's plan for your eternal destiny, for your transformation in the likeness of Christ. What Jesus is teaching here is what we read from the Ecclesiastes writer, who in one way is despairing and meaningless, but on the other hand, he says, but there's something I don't know. God knows there's a time to be born, a time to die, a time for this, a time for that. And then later on, we didn't read as far as that, but in that Ecclesiastes chapter 3, it says, but God's made everything beautiful in its time. He's the God of all time. There's no such thing as coincidence. There's no such thing. Yeah, we can make mistakes, but God doesn't make a mistake. We can try and mess up our own time and do things we wish we hadn't, but God still uses every single thing to bring about his purpose. So we don't go with the watery, new age kind of, well, there's a time for everything, and it wasn't meant to be. Why wasn't it meant to be? What do you mean there's a time for everything? Well, what's the point though? Well, God has a point because he created the time. And John has seen something much bigger than just some mystical force of fate that has no meaning behind it, but rather the God of all time. Why isn't it time? Why wasn't it meant to be this way? Why didn't Jesus die when his opponents tried to push him off the edge of a cliff? We've looked at that earlier in this gospel. There was purpose behind it. If he had just died, fallen off the edge of a cliff, he wouldn't have died for our sins. He had to die under law. He had to get to Jerusalem. He had to go through mock trial as it was to die under law. Why? Because one day we face God who has law and brings every deed into judgment. How are you going to get into heaven? If he brings every deed, every single last thought, every single last word you've done wrong, how are you going to get into heaven? Well, if you have your faith in Jesus, he already died under law to take your place under law so that you are free. If you put your trust in the Lord, repent and believe in him. That's why Jesus had to have a specific time to go to that cross. It couldn't be just dying any old way. He had to die in a specific way at a specific time. Now we see it, they said. You are from God. Once you get that, you realise there's a plan behind time. There's a plan behind your time because it comes from God. Anyone ever get caught up with the old what ifs? If only, if only I hadn't done this and my life would have been different, or if only I had this happen. It's all rubbish. It's all rubbish. Like I said before, we can make mistakes, but God doesn't make mistakes. There's no such thing as an if only. God planned time and determined the time set for us for his plan and purpose for us. To reach out to him, to find him, but also even those of us who know him already to be transformed in that time, in that way. Anybody been praying for something and no answer yet? No answer. What's going on? It's not God's time. He has a time, but he's told us also in this text, he doesn't just have a time. He will overcome. He will overcome. Anybody got trials, things, temptation, things that just won't go away? There's a time when he will overcome. And he wants you simply to be faithful and hold fast to him until that time. Remember when Jesus said about the sparrow falling to the ground, the Father? Yeah, I've read little kids' books, so I'll probably ask you all now. God knows where every sparrow falls? No! That's not what it says. God doesn't just know where every sparrow falls. not one sparrow falls to the ground apart from the will of your Father in heaven. He has everything in time so worked out, even the time that sparrow falls is under the power of the God of all time. So do you believe that Jesus is from God and He is the God over your time? You think there's so much in this, we're going to have to come back and tackle it again next week, but hold fast to the God of all time. Let's pray.